I have prepared for the work by taking straight-on photos of the area. The combed area will be a triangle which forms the side of a bay, which will be in the sitting room area of a barn conversion. The bottom of the windows are about 2.5 metres above the ground. To do combed parget, I always use a ready mix top coat, which is chalk, lime and synthetic hair. This is the same mix that's used in East Anglia to plaster the outside of old timber frame buildings.
So this is the hair chalk mix which we use for a top coat. So you just got to get in there, make sure you've got all the lumps out.
The undercoat needs to be moistened well enough that it will not pull all the water out of the parget coat. And so for large areas, I work with a flat coat plasterer who lays on a few square metres of plaster, about 6 to 10 millimetres deep, and they get it level, and I don't let them get too far ahead of me. Right, so I'm ready to put the combed pattern onto this triangular area that Pete's plastered up. And I'll start out by giving it a border, using the border mould, and then running that border mould against the spirit level to make good verticals and horizontals. And then I'll tidy it out with a joint rule. I've got two different spirit levels, so one large and one small. And when I've finished doing that, then I need to fill it in with the comb which I made. But before I start using the comb, it's quite important to get the horizontals and verticals really nice. It's very easy for the combing to wander off. And to make sure it stays regular, I use a grid. And generally I'll use a grid like this, which is a stick with some nails in, and the nails are just the right size for the comb. If I'm doing a large area, I'll do it with a square grid like this. But I think on this job, a vertical one will do nicely. And then a few more tools which might come in useful. A small trowel, a small tool, and another little small tool, and a brush, which I shall use towards the end of the job. And then to keep everything clean, I've got a bowl of water with a cloth and a brush to clean up the tools. There's a piece of wood sticking out by my hand, and behind my bum isn't proper triangle either. So I'm going to have to make a border that works around that problem. So it's going to be about 6 inches wide on the left-hand side, so that the wood is in part of the border rather than in the pargeted area. I've got a set square there, so I can make sure that the border runs parallel to the wall, and mark that out. So this is just defining the space at the moment. And then I want the same depth on the lower bit of the wall and on the bottom. So there we go. There's the well-defined space. And I'm just having a look at this because I was wondering if I could make it go all the way down to the corner, but no, I think it would look a mess. So we'll go with the slightly angled triangle. Now here I've got the border mould, which is made with a piece of half a piece of copper pipe angled off at each end and fixed to a piece of wood with some car body filler. And I'll keep running along that up and down until I get a reasonably good quality finish and I can see where the border should be. But there's no point in getting it absolutely perfect now, because when I do the inside of the panel, it will get damaged. And just here, the plaster's a bit thin, but I can deal with that later. And there we are. That's a good idea to use your spirit level as your straight edge. Yes, you can see the border because it's triangular, the border mould is triangular at the edge, it does chamfers at the edge of the panel very neatly. I mean, you will notice that it all looks a bit messy at the moment, and I don't need to get anything like perfect at the moment. The real task that I'm doing now is defining the shape where the parget will be. Right, now I have a piece of wood with holes in it which measures out the grid for my parget. It's really easy for a combed or stamped parget to wander up or wander down. So I've always thought it's a good idea to make a grid to work to. It does mean that if you're not careful, you have lots of little dots all over your pargets, but that's actually not too much of a problem because you can make sure as you go along that you comb or stamp the dots into non-existence. Here we are. I'm just found my comb, and here we are. I'm going to do a basket weave pattern. So it goes horizontal and then vertical. Because this is into chalk and it's very sticky, using a sort of a slightly dotty motion makes it not stick so much. I've oiled the comb as well, which helps to stop the plaster sticking to it. But any minute now, I'll decide there's far too much plaster on it, and either I will use water or perhaps my hand to clean it up a little bit. I don't think my workmanship is ideal here. I'm trying to do it above my head, which is for the camera, which is not what one usually does, but I think when I get a bit higher, I will be working in front of myself and it will look a bit better. Actually, perfection is not necessary. What you want to do is get something that looks rhythmic. Once you walk away from it, the fact that it's not perfect doesn't matter. And here we are. And when I get to the end of the panel, it's not a complete basket, so it will run over the border. So that's why it didn't really matter if the border wasn't perfect to begin with, because you're going to have to come back later. There we are. I'm now working with the panel much more in front of myself, so I can get a better finish. There we go, like that. And I'm just cleaning it off with my hand there. It takes a while to do this, so you don't want to let your flatwork plasterer get too far ahead of you. And then there, if once the camera pulls back, detail of being perfect doesn't really matter because it's got to look, it looks good as a piece. Now I'm going to need to walk away from this for a little while. Like all plastering, you don't want to fiddle around with it. You want to give it a chance to set up. So I think it's lunchtime, and I'm just about to go off and have lunch instead. Right, so I've come back after lunch and the plaster is still fairly soft, so I've got to be pretty gentle with it. But it's probably time to tidy up the border. Before I put the camera back in action, I tidied up the top part of the border, but the bottom part is yet to be done. And the plaster is a little bit shallow, so I'm going to have to add in a little more at the edge to make the moulding completely semicircular. So that's what I'm doing here. And then when I've done that, I'll take the border mould again and run it backwards and forwards. It's a good idea to keep the border mould pretty clean at this stage because you don't want to drag the plaster. And sometimes running one way is the easy way to do it, and sometimes running the other way. And here I'm just tidying up a nice chamfered corner. It makes the whole parget look smart and professional. Then I'll run down there, and the body of the plaster is now looking fairly complete. The surface of the plaster doesn't have to be perfect at this stage because you can always tidy that up later, but it's the bulk of the plaster you want to get in the right place. There we are, that's chamfering through there, and it's a little bit sticky here, so it's better to run that the other way perhaps. Have another go at that. Between it, running one way and the other, it will start to look smart if hidden behind my head. If you're outdoors, then the top of the plaster looks a lot better if it's a flat top. All the high points are all the same height. And so I will tend to go over it with a small trowel, just flattening off the high points. Indoors, what looks more important is because you're looking at it close to, it's that you don't get flat high points. So what I will tend to do is wait till it's a little bit more set and then just go over it gently with my hand to sort of tuck back the surface, and so there's no loose hairs and things hanging around. But it's also more important to do things like this. There's scaggy little bits which I need to pull off and just tidy up, especially indoors where it's looked at closely. You do have to just tidy it up a little bit. Just going over it with my hand, I think it's probably a little early for doing that. You want a bit of resistance in the plaster before you do it. If I'm gentle, that's all right. Right, so the other thing I have to do is tidy up the border. And so I'll use a small tool to just make the line between the round mould and the flat part of the border neat. So here I'm moving, to some extent, I'm moving the body of the plaster still. And as it sets up, you stop moving the body of the plaster and you only start to move the surface just to get a surface finish. And I'm sort of getting to that stage, but not yet, really. Especially not here. This body of plaster needs to be moved quite a bit here. You can see I'm not an expert photographer and that my arm is in the way. There we are. And then that's when a small trowel comes in useful, is you can consolidate the edges. If it were a really small trowel, I could do it sort of through 90 degrees, but it isn't that small. Yeah, I'm sort of pressing down a reasonable amount to make it nice and consolidated. Right, so that's finished with the panel for the time being. I shall walk away from it for a couple of hours now, and then when it's consolidated a lot more and become quite a bit firmer, I can come back with a damp paintbrush and just tidy up the final details on it, but not yet. Right, Peter's putting on a coat of plaster which is hydrated lime and sand. sand as the aggregate is much better for stamped work because the stamp releases more easily, which is why it's a very different colour to the chalk and lime putty mixture that I used for the coned work. The plan is to have a horizontal band underneath the windows. There's 3 of these skylight windows from one side of the room to the other. And so I'll begin by using a spirit level to get a good horizontal line across the room. You can just see the second window coming into play. I think for this demonstration I shall just parget the area you can see here because it would take too long otherwise. Here's the spacer for the stamps that I'm going to use. And I have 2 stamps, a flower stamp, which I made in one of the other films, and a basket weave stamp, which is exactly the same size, which matches it. There we are. I'll use the stamp to make the spacing correct. And then with stamps like this, it's really worth using water as a release agent. So keep your stamps really clean and wet, and then they'll come off the plaster very easily. You can see they're exactly the same size. And the plan is to do a flower and then a horizontal basket weave and then a flower and a vertical basket weave. And you have to stamp them into the surface. A hammer is quite a good option here, and I think in a little while I will find one. There we are, we've got a horizontal basket weave here. And that hasn't come away very cleanly, so I think we're going to have to do a bit of making good there. You can always tidy it up later. And then here we are with another flower, and I've dipped that into the bowl of water. Oh yeah, I've taken up a piece of wood now. I've dipped that into the bowl of water so that it releases easily. You can see that it's quite shiny, that's water. And then we're back to the basket weave, but this time a vertical. Yep, that's come away better. And just repeat till finished. And yes, that's coming away nicely now. Ah, there we are. By now I've discovered that hammer exists. They're quite useful. And as with the combed work, once you've finished the stamping, you want to walk away from it for a little while before you come back and tidy it up. So you can, especially indoors where people will look at it closely, spending a little bit of time making sure it's neat and tidy is worth doing. But at the moment it's moving around too much, so you don't want to do it just yet. Leave it an hour or 2. There are a few tiny holes where the guide was, and I need to fill those in if they're not disappeared already, and a little bit of making good. But all of that I will leave until the plaster's set up a little bit. What I'm going to do now is where the plaster joins onto the flatwork plaster, run a trowel over it just to get a nice tidy edge to it, because that will always look a mess if it's not done correctly. So you want to try and modify that to make it look good. And so here, just sort of basically I'm scraping the plaster away as much as anything to get a nice horizontal line to the stamp. If you'd like to know more about pargeting, please see my YouTube channel, Anna Kettle Pargeter.